So our topic at hand today is, well, leading back to those troublesome cars that we might come across in our diagnostic day with misfire diagnosis, right? Sometimes these can be a little tricky. Sometimes they're straightforward. Sometimes they can be a little off the wall. But the main thing you want to remember when diagnosing any sort of drivability misfire type problem is you have four ingredients. That's really it. Four ingredients. And if any of them are not quite right, then you'll get a misfire. So for example, air, fuel, spark, and compression. So out of those four, if the compression's a little low, or my spark isn't quite right, or I have too much fuel or not enough fuel, or too much air, not enough air, that can cause a misfire, either multiple cylinder misfire, depending on where the problem is, or single cylinder misfire that's just stuck to one cylinder. And then I just need to find out where it is. So there's a couple different places we can look. So oxygen sensors is the first part. So that's kind of reading our air and fuel, if you think about that, or more air than fuel. But first off, we're going to talk about the typical Zirconia sensor. So those have been around since the 80s, right? And they still use them nowadays. A lot of times there's only one of the sensors on the vehicle, but we have the single wire sensor, if you think way, way, way back, the early ones. And then we have the more typical four wire sensor here with a heater circuit in there. So what it does is the heated Zirconia sensor produces a voltage, right? So based on the oxygen content in the exhaust gas, it is going to produce a voltage roughly between 0 millivolts and 900 millivolts. It is a Zirconia membrane in here, in between, sandwiched in between the heaters. And then we also have the exhaust gas on one side, and then we have reference air from the outside coming in the other side. So you ever seen a oxygen sensor? You might see on the back it's got some little holes or some little indentations where outside air can get in. That's its reference. So based on what's coming on outside and what's going on with the exhaust gas, it can say, here's how much oxygen is left over in this exhaust gas. Now it's most accurate around 455 millivolts, which is roughly halfway in between there, which represents about 14.7 to 1, which is what we want for a well-running vehicle. And due to this, the ECM must switch backwards and forwards from rich to lean, or adding fuel and taking fuel away. And we'll talk more about fuel trims here in a second. But it switches by design. So as we said, an ideal ratio of 14.7 to 1 is roughly 455 millivolts, which is right in here, a very narrow band of voltage. So you may hear this also called a narrow band oxygen sensor. As I said before, the ECM needs to switch. So it's going to read up and down. So there's, the high side, and there's the low side, high side, low side, high side, low side. This will constantly be switching back and forth and chasing the air-fuel ratio to try and get it as close up to as close to stoichiometric as we are. Now, AF sensors kind of work in the opposite direction. So the voltage that they produce is a little different. So here's an example. Air-fuel ratio sensor looks very similar to a heated Zirconia sensor. And the wideband AF sensor. So we have, it's basically two Zirconia sensors sandwiched together with reference air in the middle. Actually, it has reference outside air. And then what it does is it takes this pump current here from the exhaust gas and moves some exhaust gas in and out of this center chamber, trying to keep that stoichiometric to 1, right? So this little symbol right there, and this is not sideways here, they call it, that's a lambda, so that's a Greek letter lambda. You might also hear it called lambda of 1. So stoichiometric, lambda of 1 is stoichiometric, 14.7 to 1, all right? So this is and then the voltage reading is over here. So that is a Zirconia, like a Zirconia oxygen sensor reading that. So we have two different membranes sandwiched together. So like I said, it's basically two Zirconia sensors or cells mated together in a planar form. So like a piece of plywood, right? So different plies. The AFR sensor uses an entirely different operating strategy than a conventional Zirconia sensor. It's actually opposite the way it reacts. So one cell is used to measure oxygen content in the exhaust stream. And then the other one is supplied with a very small, so that's in the exhaust stream there. And the other one is supplied with a very small current from the PCM capable of moving oxygen ions in or out of this in the middle here through this diffusion gap. So the electric current achieves a stoichiometric ratio between both cells, and that's known as a pumping cell here. And it operates at about 1200 degrees Fahrenheit to work properly. Now, the Zirconia sensor is about half that. It's around 640 degrees Fahrenheit in order to operate. And like I said, the pump cell will pump the ions in and out into this monitoring chamber, and then it measures this, and then it measures the voltage, and all the math is done by the PCM internally, right? So due to that, though, you can really only read the voltage PID is the way you're going to check it. So the PCM monitors the varying current. The PCM converts the current into a voltage value PID. The best way to test an AF sensor signal is by monitoring the AFR voltage PID. So like I said, all that calculation is done within the computer. So it is possible to monitor it with monitor the current that's actually in there, but it's very, very, very small, low milliamp range. You're not going to read it with a low amp probe. You actually need something more of a microamp probe, which are kind of hard to come by, and they're kind of pricey for just one little thing. And it's difficult to monitor. So, like I said, best way to monitor those is with the AFR voltage PID. And as we can see, the voltage, so the voltage runs about 2.4 volts to 4 volts internally, and that is much wider range than you would get with the Zirconia sensor. There we go. And that allows it to monitor a much wider range from 12 to 1 to about 19 to 1. So it's you might hear these called a wideband oxygen sensor, right? And like I said, they operate differently opposite of each other, right? So my if it's rich, I'm going to have high voltage on my Zirconia sensor and low voltage on my AF sensor. And if it's lean, I'll have high voltage on my AF sensor and low voltage on my Zirconia sensor, right? So that leads me to fuel trims. So fuel trim's often misunderstood, but this can really help us when it comes to diagnosing a misfire. If it's a lean miss or a rich miss, then we can know, depending on where my fuel trims are at, what that vehicle's been doing either right now or what it has been doing over the past, however long period of time it's been monitoring. So fuel trim is a window that allows you to see what the computer is doing to control fuel delivery and determine how the PCM's adaptive strategy is operating. So we want to get to the 14.7 to 1. So let's say the front oxygen sensor is reading lean. All right. So if it's reading lean, that means the computer is going to send a command that says add some fuel. So we get a positive fuel trim number. So plus 2% or 4% or whatever. It's going to add fuel until all of a sudden the front sensor says, oh, now I'm rich. Now I got too much fuel. Let's take some away. So then you get a negative fuel trim. So it keeps going kind of back and forth. Remember how I said it's kind of chasing each other around. And then it'll pull fuel, and then, oh, now we're too lean. And then add fuel, and now we're too rich, and so on and so forth. It's just a closed loop of driving, right? That is that's what you're going to see. Now, your oxygen sensor, as I said, is going to feed into your short-term fuel trim, so it's going to be moving back and forth in the short term. And then if we have an issue in there, we are going to get short-term fuel trims are going to, if they're 5%, 10%, whatever they happen to be for a long period of time, then that'll feed in a long-term fuel trim, and the long-term fuel trim will start heading up or down, depending on what direction the short-term fuel trim is on. So you can use these numbers when looking at how a vehicle is running and saying, okay, how is it running now using the short-term fuel trim? And then how has it been running over a period of time? And that's the long-term fuel trim. So if your long-term fuel trim is at a high positive, then you know it's been running lean for a while. If it's only at a very low positive, like a couple percent, then you know it's probably only been a little while, but judge by what your short-term fuel trim is doing. So we're going to look at some data and see how they react and how it would look on a scan tool, right? So we're going to create a vacuum leak on a car. We're going to look at the oxygen sensors front and rear, and then see the relationship to the fuel trims, and then we're going to repair the vacuum leak and see what happens. All right, so this is on a Subaru. It's actually on my car. So the rear oxygen sensor on this is a Zirconia sensor. Front air-fuel ratio sensor is going to be an air-fuel ratio sensor. And then on Subaru, they're a little weird compared to some other OEMs. So what they call their short-term fuel trim is correction, air-fuel correction, which I guess kind of makes sense because that's how it's correcting in the now. And then their long-term fuel trim is air-fuel learning. So it's learning from the corrected values. So instead of calling it long-term fuel trim and short-term fuel trim, it calls it correction and learning. Same thing, different way of calling it. So here's my rear oxygen sensor. reading on the high side, which is normal. That means my cat's working the way it should. Air-fuel ratio sensor over here, it's running roughly 1, which is where we want it, right? We want to keep it in that stoichiometric, that lambda of 1. So roughly 1, and then it kind of goes up a little bit. Over here, our air-fuel correction kind of goes up a little bit, and our air-fuel learning was kind of at a positive 3. So this is kind of normal running, and then here's where we just kind of crack the hose off to create a vacuum leak. And you see, as it increases, as that vacuum increases, you can see the air-fuel ratio sensor kind of goes up, and then the rear sensor will go down because lean would be down and rich would be up. So we can see how it kind of goes up, and then all of a sudden we get to full lean. This is like 35% air-fuel correction. So it's saying add fuel, add fuel, add fuel, please add fuel. I don't have enough fuel, please add fuel. And it maxed out at about 35% up here. And you can see that air-fuel ratio kind of went way up to about 1.12. And then we decided to put it back on, put the hose back on. Now also the long-term fuel trim is adjusting. You can see it lags a little bit behind there. It even goes when we're at 35% for a long period of time. It takes a very long time for it to go up to that 7%, right? Then we repair the leak, and then all of a sudden the air-fuel ratio sensor goes way down to rich. And then my short-term fuel trims go down to rich as well. So negative fuel trims here goes down to rich. Now, why did it go down to rich? Because it was overcorrecting in one way. Now it's like, oh, wow, now we're way too much fuel, so now we got to pull as much as we possibly can. So then it goes to a negative. And then eventually it stabilizes out over here. So we get, roughly back to 1 over there. So we can see how that kind of goes through that whole thing. Now the long-term fuel trim also is going to take a long time to get back down to where it was because it's averaging over that long period of time, right? So just be aware if you have a short-term fuel trim that's high, you got a lean condition. It's kind of a rule of thumb here. So you're good to go roughly between plus or minus 5%. Now this is observing long-term fuel trim. I would say in the context of the vehicle actually driving, you can use this roughly for the short-term fuel trim as well. So plus or minus 5%, it's doing what it's supposed to do. If you see short-term fuel trims in the plus or minus 5%, it's doing what it's supposed to do. Yellow light, plus or minus 6 to plus or minus 19, which I think might be a little high. I say when you see double digits, you probably should be looking at some stuff. It's compensating fuel trim for a possible wear and tear item, clean, inspect, and service. And then over 20%, you're probably going to get a check engine light. And that is it's going to set a code and probably have a check engine light in that case, over 20%. So just kind of use that as a rule of thumb for your air-fuel ratio and, am I rich, am I lean, that sort of thing. And then just here's a quick table you can refer to. So lean condition is going to send a rich command. So you're going to have low side on the Zirconia sensor. Short-term, long-term fuel trim could be plus up to 100%. It's probably never going to get there, but you will add fuel by increasing pulse width on the injector. For stoichiometric, around about 450 millivolts. Fuel trim should be roughly 0. Just going to pulse the injector as it's supposed to. And then if it's rich, it's going to send a lean command, say, hey, let's pull some fuel. So we get a negative fuel trim. And we'll subtract fuel by decreasing the pulse width there. So quick little cheat sheet there. So that's air and fuel. Talked about our first 2 ingredients. And then fuel by itself would be fuel injectors. So we can test a fuel injector in 3 different ways. We can check it electrically to see how the circuit is doing, verify the component is actually operating. Mechanically, by viewing the current flow, we can see it actually open and close by knowing what to look at in the current. And then we can also look hydraulically if we use a pressure transducer, looking for the pressure drop and verify the state of flow through the injector. So it would look something like this if I was looking at all 3. So this is my voltage going through the circuit. So I should have alternator voltage coming in, then the PCM grounds it to turn it on. So I should see roughly ground. And that's going to hold it on for a set amount of time. It's going to store all that voltage in the coil inside the injector. And then when it releases, I should see a big spike here because it's going to release all that stored voltage. Like I said, it works on a similar principle to an ignition coil. Then it'll come down, and normally we would see another little bump right here. That's the point where the pintle actually closes, hits the seat, so it throws another little bit more juice out of the coil, and then it comes down here back to alternator voltage. Current ramp should start up the same time as the ground starts. It's going to make a nice smooth curve, and in here you should see some sort of a dip. So that is the point where the pintle actually leaves the seat and starts spraying fuel. So if I wanted to look at this, that's where the fuel injector actually opens because it takes a little bit of time to get it to move. There's where it actually opens, and there's where it actually closes over there. So it's going to be a little offset from where this voltage pattern shows. So if we wanted to look at that a little deeper, we got a standard top feed fuel injector here. I got battery power and grounded by the PCM. There's the pintle there. So if we ground it, pulls it up off the seat, it's going to open up. And then when it's time to close, it's going to release that ground, and then it's going to go like that. Current, same deal. It's going to increase, it's going to open up. And then once it's done opening and once it's done spraying its pulse, then the PCM is going to release the ground and it's going to close. Go back there. And then pressure is going to do something as well. So when we open it, we're going to see that it'll drop. Now, that's not a huge drop, you can see. It didn't drop off too much. We're around 35 PSI, get down to about maybe 32 PSI. It wasn't a huge drop off. Of course, we're talking about milliseconds of time being open as well. But one thing you probably should see is when that injector closes, you should see a spike because it's flowing through the injector and all of a sudden it has nowhere to go. So it kind of pops back into the fuel rail. And then you see a little bit of a spike and then it'll level back off as it should. So that's your 3 ways of checking that. So that's air fuel ratio, and fuel. Now let's look at spark. Let's look at ignition. So ignition coils work on what they call mutual induction. So that's a transfer of energy from one coil to another coil placed in close proximity to each other. So there's one coil connected to the voltage source that's going to be called the primary winding of the coil. So that's going to be this guy over here. And then the second coil connected to another circuit is going to be your secondary winding. So that's this guy over here. Now in this example, we have 10 turns of wire, and it's a common magnet, right? It's an iron core usually. So we have 10 turns of copper wire around this side. We have 1,000 turns of copper wire around this side. I'm going to apply 14 volts and 14 amps. Is going to give us 196 watts of energy to work with. It's going to increase the magnetic field here. When that magnetic field collapses, it's going to transfer that 196 watts across. The current is going to drop by a factor of about 100 to 1 because it's 10 times 100 gives us 1,000. It's going to drop by a factor of 100, and the voltage is going to increase by a factor of 100. So if you can think about, depending on how many windings I have, that's how I can get my 10, 20, 30,000 volts out of a coil. It's going to look something kind of like this. So we're going to turn on the power. That's going to be dwell. It's going to be charging the primary side of the coil. We're going to see it's going to go in there. It's going to generate a magnetic field. Once it's done, once it's generated that magnetic field, it's going to release that voltage, and it's going to come and transfer across, and that gives us the juice in order to jump that gap in order to fire the spark plug, right? So it's a very simplistic design, but it's going to be, that's basically how it works. And if we were to analyze an ignition pattern, it's going to have 3 main sections. We're going to have our dwell section. Like I said, that's when we first initially start charging the primary side of the coil. Then when we release that, we're going to have our firing line. So we have our firing section here. We get the firing line, and then it's going to drop down to the spark line. Then depending on how efficient our coil is, we may have multiple of these up and down. They call that the ringing out of the coil, right? So we're going to have these oscillations. That's the word I'm looking for. Coil oscillations in here. There's going to be basically all the excess voltage kind of jostling its way out of the coil and back into the circuit. If you have a very efficient coil, you only have a couple of them. If you have a less efficient coil, you could have many, especially on like the older distributor cap and coil and rotor vehicles. That coil had to have plenty of juice in reserve, so you might see a lot of extra there. And then it starts back over here at dwell again. Right, so that is a standard spark plug or ignition signature. So there's a few different ways we can test our ignition coil. So we have a control signal, which is going to connect to ignition control circuit. So that's usually going to be just a 5-volt square wave, and that's going to correspond with the dwell section of that firing line. So it's usually just a 5 volts, like you see here, just 5 volts on and then off. So when it's on, it's in dwell. When it turns off, that's signal to fire the coil. So if we were to compare that over a secondary ignition pattern, here's where dwell starts, and lo and behold, that's where the 5 volts starts. When the 5 volts ends, that's where my firing line is. Right, easy enough. You can also check for primary voltage, and we should get a similar signal to our secondary voltage signal. we would connect the ignition coil primary circuit, voltage going in. In this case, there's where dwell starts, and then you can see it kind of drops a little bit during dwell, and then there's my firing event right there, and then my spark line would be over here. Not a lot of detail on this particular coil just because of how the coil is constructed. Some vehicles with a 2-wire coil, you can get a beautiful picture that almost the primary side almost looks like the secondary side, just at a lower voltage. So it just kind of depends on how the coil is set up. So this one, it's got an internal ignition control and everything like that. So it's a little harder to get a good pattern out of it, or a normal looking pattern out of it, but that's, I mean, it's plenty serviceable for what it is. And then if we wanted to compare it, notice how dwell starts, voltage drops a little bit, and then the firing lines match up as well. So we can make sure it's firing at least. Secondary voltage, you're going to connect to a spark plug or coil wire, depending on how it's set up, or directly on the coil on plug system. So in this case, it's a coil on plug vehicle, and I have a little flag pickup set up there. If you want more information on how to hook these up, I have other more detailed classes on ignition you can go check out on the channel. This is just kind of like for diagnosing misfires, here's some tools we might want to use type of class, right? Okay, so it's going to look something like that. So I have my dwell, and then I have my firing line, and then I have my spark line. And then the last test we can do is current. So you can check the current flow through it. So you're going to hook a low amp probe connected to the coil feed on that side. And it should look something like this. So we want to have a nice smooth ramp up. In this case, it's current limited, so it stops at about 12 amps. And then when it fires, it should match up with the firing line. So there we go. All right, so we got that, we got that. There we go. So that's fuel, air, spark. Last one's compression. So we have a couple different ways of checking compression, or a couple different tests we can use to check compression on a vehicle. First one is relative compression. So this is going to give us pressure in the cylinders relative to each other by using current flowing through the starter. So the starter is going to crank the engine over, and if I have lower compression in one or multiple cylinders, you will see a lower result because it doesn't have to work as hard to turn that cylinder over if it does lower compression. So example, this is a vehicle with a bad catalytic converter on one bank, so on the odd number bank. So we can see 163 or 153. And then it starts with cylinder 1 here again. So it's much lower on that side than it is on the other side. And then this is the normal bank over here, the 642. All right, so we can see how we have a large pressure pulse, and then we have a low vacuum pull. So it's not pulling nearly as much vacuum on that side as that side. And this is just looking at a relative compression. So we can kind of see how it's just going with each other with that. If it was normal, they'd all be pretty much the same relative to each other. And then we have running compression. So when I figure out maybe I have poor compression in one of the cylinders, then I can go to that cylinder and investigate with a running compression test, which will tell us the 4 different strokes of the engine as it's going. So here's an example off a 4-cylinder Subaru. It's off of my car. So we can see the compression come up, gets to top dead center. Then we have the power stroke coming down here. Should see a little bit of a vacuum pocket there. And then we go up into the exhaust stroke. So there's the exhaust stroke there. We don't want to see that exhaust stroke going up over 0, and I'll show you why in a minute. But that looks pretty good there. I can actually see the individual exhaust pulses in the other cylinders. And then my intake valves will open somewhere in here. And then I should see another intake pull down to vacuum here. The vacuum here and the vacuum here should be pretty darn close. Should be able to draw a straight line between that because it should be pulling in the same amount of vacuum as it produces, roughly. Because an engine's an air pump. Just remember that. And then the compression stroke starts again, and then power stroke, and the exhaust stroke, and the intake stroke, and so on. So that is on a known good vehicle. That's what it would look like. Here's one on a bad vehicle. So this one had very little to no compression at all on one cylinder. And then if we would compare that to its sister cylinder next to it, here's what it would look like on the normal cylinder. So that's a good lesson too. Don't just go to the bad cylinder first and expect to see something good. You're probably going to see something bad. Makes sense because it's the bad cylinder. Always compare it to another known good cylinder in that case. And then here's an example on that Jeep I was showing you earlier where it had the weird relative compression test. This is, notice how we have 0 PSI right here, and this exhaust stroke pressure is ramping up considerably on this cylinder. So that vehicle ended up having a bad cat and a clogged exhaust. So it had a clogged exhaust on one side, couldn't get that pressure out the tailpipe. So it was building up pressure as it was trying to remove that pressure from the cylinder. It eventually made it out, of course, but it was just building up and just kind of backing up back into the cylinder. It was causing a misfire on one bank on that vehicle. So that's just another look at something that could go wrong. And then lastly, I wanted to show you everything kind of all together. So we have air, fuel, and spark and compression all together. So this is my ignition event right here, current ramp. It's going to be a little bit before top dead center. Remember how we talked about compression and top dead center there. Then it comes down into my power stroke. Then I have my exhaust stroke. Here's where the fuel injector fires right here. So there's my fuel and air being added, and there's where my valve overlap is. And you can see the pattern changes. So here's my exhaust, and then here's my intake, and there's my overlap. You can see how it's not as smooth over here. And of course, I have some swirl going on and things like that. And you can actually pick that up with the pressure transducer. Comes in, and then we compress, and then we fire again, and it comes back down. You can see it all using current flow for spark. You can see the voltage for the injector, and we can see the pressure transducer for the pressure. So I think that's pretty cool how you can see all those different things. And if one of those things wasn't quite right, then you know where you need to look to diagnose your misfire. So that's my slides. Let's go on the tool and look at a couple other things that we might be able to look at with that. All right, so with that, we are going to go to my scan tool. There we go. All right, so I have a couple of vehicles pulled up here. So first one's going to be a 2019 Ford Escape. And on many Ford vehicles, not just the Ford Escape, but on many Ford vehicles, we have some built-in things inside the ECM that you can do. So functional tests, special functions, and we have the relative compression test, which actually does, it will crank over the vehicle, hold down the accelerator pedal to go in a fuel cut. It'll crank over the vehicle for you and measure based on cam crank timing whether or not you have an issue. So relative compression identifies a compression problem by comparing the average cranking RPM of each cylinder to the mean RPM of all cylinders. Maximum compression of a cylinder occurs when the crankshaft position sensor signal from the previous cylinder is low. A cylinder with less compression will cause the crankshaft position sensor to accelerate more than the other cylinders. A cylinder with a greater crankshaft position sensor acceleration is displayed as a percentage difference to the mean RPM. So it's going to give you a result at the end. And the test is designed to detect only one weak cylinder in the engine. So if you have multiple weak cylinders, it might not work so well. And then we also have relative injector flow test, which is going to pulse the injectors. Follow recommended powertrain control emissions diagnosis workshop manual fuel system pressure release procedures prior to service. And it's going to use multiple sensors to see where you might have a high pressure fuel system gross leak. So that's helpful. And then there's also the power balance test. So this is on most Fords at this point. And what that does is it gives you both a graphical representation of the balance between the different cylinders. So there's cylinder 1, 3, 4, and 2. If they're all relatively even, then you know it's okay. If one's way lower or one's way higher, you know you have a problem, and that's the one you need to look at. Also with this test, you can disable the injectors. So you can say I wanted to disable injector 1 to make it so there was no fuel going into that cylinder, and that would induce a misfire on that cylinder, and see if it runs any different. If you do that and it doesn't run any different, then that's probably where you need to look, I would imagine. All right, so that kind of combines two Ford IDS tests into one. So that gives us the nice graphical. It also gives you a history on the graph, which is nice. So you can see historically, was it higher or lower. Also in here, on the guided component test, there should be some stuff. Which one did I pick? I think I picked the 2-liter. Let's go into engine system. And then you should see things like maybe crank position sensor, cam position sensor. I didn't really talk about timing, but that could be an issue too. And that would lead to compression issue if your timing's not quite right. Ignition tests, of course. We can do primary tests and secondary tests in here. So there's a coil current RFI test, RFI high output test, and a secondary ignition test that you can do, as well as primary test, key on engine cranking, and signature test. So it's going to tell you where to hook up, and it's going to give you a signature test on that. This one has a multi-strike ignition coil, so you would see possibly multiple strikes on there. Next one I'll pull up is a BMW 3 Series 2018. So on this one, actually, yeah, I think we got some. I think there was a scanner thing I want to look at in here, if I recall. Functional test, special functions. There's a timing chain test, which is good. So once again, if you had a problem with that, may need to do a reset adaptation values, reset fuel trims. Data, maybe separate cylinder status data. All right, so that'll tell you misfire counts, rough running values, knock signals. So that's all helpful data. And then there's also some special guided component tests on BMWs, which are very helpful. We have a compression test actually on the using the scope. So there's a relative cranking compression with a low amps probe. There's also a relative cranking compression using secondary probe test leads. So it's actually set up to use the voltage test leads. We check using the regular supplied test leads and the special ignition presets that have been programmed in a test for this engine. So it'll actually show you the up and down relative without having to use a low amp probe. You can actually just use the one and ground, go on the battery, and then crank it over, and it'll show you relative compression with that. So that's a nice tool. That's a tool that we specially developed for BMW. I think we've passed it over to other vehicles, but I know for sure it's definitely on the on BMWs. Variable valve timing, I guess. Oxygen sensor tests, right? Ignition tests can be done. Fuel system tests for the fuel injector, that was also available on the Ford as well. So that's a good one. And then we have Jeep Renegade here. So give CDJR a little bit that they can do. Because they are unique in the scanner side of things. We'll go through security link. Okay, and then we'll go to engine. And then on this, there is a not miscellaneous functions, a system test. System test that's going to be called which cylinder is misfiring. So that is a misfire test for this, and basically it just gives you the data for that. So in this case, it's a simulator, so it's going to give me all 8 cylinders no matter what engine I pick, but it's going to tell you whether or not your misfire monitor is enabled, and then what your misfire counts are in there. So that's a special test. It's on Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, Ram. It says which cylinder is misfiring is important there. And then also in guided component tests, there should be some in here as well. So you're going to get your oxygen sensors, your coil, your fuel system, all the usual suspects there, possibly variable valve timing. And then last one I want to show is a Hyundai Santa Fe. So on the Hyundai Santa Fe, we are going to see some system tests. I might need to reset adaptives once again. If you want to reset your fuel trims before testing again. Functional tests. There's going to be oxygen sensor heaters. Let's see. EGR valve might cause a vacuum leak as well. Individual injector disables. Ignition coil enable and disable as well. So you might need those in your testing. And then also in data, they will have a separate misfire data function. That's going to total count of emissions related misfires and total count of catalyst damaging misfires. And then lastly, in guided component tests, we should have some. We actually have a cam crank relationship in this one, which is nice. So that'll give you your cam crank relationship between the cam and crank sensor. So it tells you how to hook it up. It sets it up for you, just like all of our other guided component tests. And then, of course, oxygen sensors, ignition, mass airflow sensor even, because we talk about airflow, fuel system for the injector as well. All right. So that is my tests. Let me just give me 1 second here. Yes. All right. So next week we are going to talk about OEM specific ADAS training, continuing that. And our next topic will be Tesla. So that's the only domestic we haven't done yet. So Tesla is going to be up next. And of course, if you know anything about Teslas, they do things in a very unique way. So it'll be, I think, an interesting a look into how they do things and things that can be done and things that might not be able to be done without using factory stuff. So join me again next week, same time, same place, 6 to 9 Eastern. If you want to watch the 6 p.m. class if you want to watch either class on Zoom, you can go to snapon.com/OT and register there. Or if the 6 p.m. class goes live to YouTube, so you can watch it live on YouTube, youtube.com/Snap-on Diagnostics. If you scan that QR code, you can like and subscribe the channel. And 9 p.m. Eastern class goes live to our Facebook page, so you can check it out there as well. If you want to check any of our other past topics in this series, this is episode 124 and growing. So anywhere from intro to ADAS through automatic transmissions, this class, everything in between, they're all available for free on YouTube channel. Just scan that QR code, it brings you over there. And also there is a playlist for live training that is built out with all these classes and a few more that aren't on this list because I've did a couple one-off webinars here and there. Also, do we have your email address? If we don't have your email address, you may be missing out on some good topics in your email box. So things like Techno Focus articles, SureTrack blogs, quick tips, new product releases. They send out my training schedule periodically. You're going to see maybe 1 or 2 a week at the most, depending on what's going on out there. So scan that QR code right there, and you can sign up and receive those valuable emails. Now it's time for questions. If you do have any questions on Zoom, just make sure you use that Q&A box, top or bottom of the screen, wherever that happens to be. And if you're on YouTube, make sure you use the live chat function. I am going to go to Zoom first. Let's see. Jason asks, are we seeing more applications from manufacturers with gasoline particulate filters for the U.S. market? Yes. Very sparingly so far, but I know they're coming because we've definitely been adding them to the European side of things, like in the European market. Mercedes got a ton of them. BMW's got a couple of them. And I believe there are a couple Mercedes models like in the last 2 years that have started using them over here. So we are going to start seeing them more, and I'm sure once we get to a point where there are a few more to talk about, I'm sure we'll be doing a class on it, probably next year, I'd imagine. So keep an eye out for that, but good question. And then Jason comes back with also Hyundai has hybrid models with them for 2026. So there you go. Once the 2026 start being out there a little more, I think, it'll actually give me something I can research. So thanks for that. And like I said, probably next year sometime we'll see a class for that. And then Jay says, thanks for the class. Thank you, Jay, as always, for participating and showing up. I'd also like to say hello to my friend Ephraim out in Lanham, Maryland, teaching a class today. He's got me dial in here, and I'm sure he's going to teach you some good stuff after we're done here. If you do have any questions, make sure that you have Ephraim type them in real quick because we don't have a ton of time left. Let's see. Mr. Wick on YouTube had asked, when's the update coming out? I haven't seen any updates ready for my scanner, and yes, I have subscription. So I had answered textually earlier before the class started that we have been rolling them out in phases, depending on what part of the world you're in. So if you're in North America, it gets it first, UK gets it again, and then Australia gets it after that. So depending on where you're at there, if you haven't received it yet and you're on subscription and you want it right now, just talk to your franchisee. They can easily install it on the truck. You don't have to download it over the internet. They can definitely install it on the truck. No problem. You can have it right away. We just roll it out in phases so it doesn't crash the server, basically. So it just kind of depends on where you were in the queue, and it's random. So the other best way to make sure you get it is to make sure your tool's on. Make sure it's on, connected to power, connected to Wi-Fi, and then whenever the server sends the signal, it says, hey, you can download the update, it'll download the update. Usually I just say leave it on overnight, plugged in, hooked up to Wi-Fi. When you come in the morning, hopefully it'll be downloaded by then. Let's see. Computer Custom says a new Triton only available over Wi-Fi. Not correct. You can actually get those updated on the truck as well. Any of our scan tools, even if it has the over the online capability, it does have always the ability to get it from your franchisee. So if for some reason, like I said, if you need it right away, you can definitely go see your franchisee. As long as they have it installed on their truck, you should be able to get it installed right away from them. They can just take the card out and they can do that. Mr. Wick also mentions had a misfire on a Jeep Wrangler. Go figure, compression was good, but lower on one cylinder, and coil and plug was good. After hot soak, the injector was bad. Put dealer one in, and all good. There you go. So one of those things is not like the other. Patriotic Immigrant says intros are too long. Well, I'm sorry about that. I need to let people know when it's going to actually start. That's why I have the countdown. Counts down to the top of the hour. You can always join me right at the top of the hour. Now, if you don't want to learn my little minute and a half history about me, you can always come in a minute and a half later as well. I mean, I could have multiple new people watching me every week, so that's why we do it every week. And then the replay, that gets cut out anyway. So it goes right to the intro of the class at hand. And then Nick is checking in from the UK. It's 11 o'clock over there. Let's go to bed. Hopefully you learned enough stuff tonight, and time for bed there. Let's see. And then Mr. Wick also says couldn't access a Jeep because they needed an update. Yeah, like I said. So if you don't get it in time, definitely talk to your franchisee because they can totally update it. No problem. J. Lee Lobo says hello, checking in as he does every week. And Donald Hopkins says thanks for the training. Always appreciated. And J. Lee Lobo also says thank you for everything you share with us. I've learned a lot from all these episodes. All right. So with that. Oh, got another question on the Zoom. Ephraim says no questions. Thank you very much. And thank you all for watching. Treat Ephraim very well. He's a good friend of mine. So make sure you treat him good. All right. All right. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you for spending a little bit of time with me. Hopefully you picked up a few little tips and tricks on diagnosing those pesky misfires. Hopefully I'll see you next week for more 8-ounce training. With that, enjoy the rest of your week. Enjoy your weekend. Have a nice night and take care.